Okay, so let's try to understand how we can create our own custom exception. Okay, so see, in order to work with exception handling, Java people has provided bunch of predefined exception classes, right? For example, we are having null pointer exception, arithmetic exception, class cast exception. Okay, so all these classes has been provided by the Java people. But based on our requirement, we may need to create our own custom exception class. Okay, why? Because all these predefined exception classes may not understandable by the user. Okay, so who is using your application, that person may or may not be a technical person, right? So if that person is not technical person, so he may not be able to understand what do you mean by interrupted exception, what do you mean by IO exception, what do you mean by null pointer exception, right? So for example, let's say one end user is sending one request. Okay, he is trying to log in our application by passing the username and password. Okay, and he is passing the invalid username and invalid password. Okay, so in that case, instead of throwing illegal argument exception, so we can throw some exception such a way so that that user able to understand. Okay, instead of throwing that illegal argument exception, we can throw something, let's say invalid password exception. So then by reading that exception itself, end user can able to understand. Okay, so I may be passing some invalid password. Okay, so then in the next request onwards, he will in the next request itself, so he will pass the correct password. Okay, so that is why we cannot depend upon all these predefined classes. Okay, based on our requirement, we may need to create our own custom exception and we need to throw that exception. Okay, based on our requirement itself. Okay, so then how we can create our own custom exception class. Okay, so can I write any class and can I tell like it is a custom exception class? No. See, in order to make this class, so what I mean is, if I write a class, let's say invalid password exception. Okay, so that means if I write any class, and can I write like this is a exception class? No. Okay, so in order to make this class as a exception class, okay, so what I need to do, I need to extend one class called extends exception class. So in order to make our own custom exception, or in order to make this class as an exception class, so then what we need to do, we need to extend this exception class so that all the functionality and all the behaviors, it will be inherited to my exception class itself. Okay, after writing, so then how we can create our own custom exception class? So first of all, we need to create a class and we need to extend exception class. Okay, and what we need to do, we need to write a constructor over here. Okay, public invalid password exception. Okay, and here we'll pass string message. Okay, so first of all, what we need to do, in order to make our own custom exception class, so we need to create a class, we need to extend that exception class. Okay, and we need to write the constructor and we need to pass one string message. And in this constructor, what we need to do, we need to call here super and we need to pass this message, error message or exception message. Okay, why we need to write the constructor, why I am calling this super, I will explain later. Okay, but this is how we need to create our own custom exception class. Okay, so in order to make our own custom exception class, what we need to do, we need to create a class, we need to extend the exception class, and we need to define the constructor and we need to call the super class constructor by passing this message as an input parameter. Okay, so this is how we need to write our own custom exception. So what we understood earlier, how many types of exceptions we are having? So we are having two types of exceptions are there, right? One is checked exception, one is unchecked exception. Okay, how you can able to identify this respective class is a checked exception or not? If this class is a child class of directly child class of this exception class, so that means this class is nothing but checked exception itself or not. If I want to create my own custom exception as an unchecked exception, so then what we need to do, instead of extending from this exception class, we need to extend over here runtime exception class. Okay, so now if my class will extend the runtime exception class, so then this class will become the unchecked exception. Okay, so that means compiler will not force us to handle this exception. Okay, so that is why we can create this class and we can extend the runtime exception class. Okay, so this is how we can create our own custom exception class. Okay, so now we understood how we can create our own custom exception class. Okay, so why we need to have our own custom exception? So we need to throw some exception in such a way so that end user or whoever is using our application can able to understand by reading that exception type itself. Okay, so that is why we need to create our own custom exception. Let's try to understand through some code how we can create our custom exception and how we can throw that custom exception. So what is my requirement? I need to validate, okay, the respective user is a valid user or not. Okay, for example, I am just writing a simple Java code in order to explain this custom exception. Okay, for example, let's I am writing here one class here, class test, public static void main method. I'm defining one class called, let's say, class validator, which will validate the user. Okay, how? Let's I'm defining here public void, one method I'm defining here validate, and I'm passing the input parameter as string username. Okay, so now what I want to do, I want to validate this respective username is a valid user or not. Okay, so that means let's I'm writing some business logic. Okay, some simple business logic. Let's I'm writing if username dot equals of persona, then let's I'm trying to print here system dot out dot println of valid user. Okay, now if this username, whatever it is coming as part of this method input parameter, if this value is persona, so that means it's a valid user. Okay, if it is not a valid user, so then I need to throw some exception. Okay, so now which exception I need to throw? We need to create our own exception and we need to throw that exception. Okay, so first of all, which exception I want to throw? Let's say I want to throw invalid user exception. Okay, so for that, first of all, we need to create our own custom exception class itself or not. How we can define our own custom exception class? So class invalid user exception. Okay, so this is the exception class I want to create. Okay, and I want to throw this custom exception. I want to throw this invalid user exception if this respective username is invalid. Okay, so then I need to create our own custom exception class itself or not. So can I write any class and can I tell like this is an exception class? No, right? So in order to make this class as an exception class, so what I need to do? We need to extend which class? Exception class. Either we can extend the exception class or runtime exception class. Okay, now we need to define constructor over here, invalid user exception. We need to pass here the string error message or some message I'm passing. Okay, and as part of this constructor, what we need to do? We need to call the superclass constructor message. Okay, so now this is how we need to create our own custom exception itself or not. Okay, now see what I need to do. I need to call this validate method itself or not, and I need to pass this username. If the username is Prasanna, so that means it's a valid user. Okay, but if it is not, or if it is an invalid user, so that means what I need to throw? I need to throw this invalid user exception. Okay, now how we can call this validate method? Validator v is equals to new validator. Now we need to call which method? V dot validate method, and we need to pass the respective username itself or not. Okay, let's say I am passing here Prasanna. So then what will happen? This validate method, it will be called with which value? Prasanna. So that means username value is nothing but Prasanna and it is equals to Prasanna. So that means it will print the valid user. So that means it is a valid user itself. Okay. But let's say instead of Prasanna, okay, I am passing some other name. Okay. Let's I am passing here Misra. So then what will happen? This validate method it will be called. Now it will be this username value it will be passed as Misra itself or not, okay, and which is not equals. So that means it will not comes to this if block and it is not a valid user. So that means what we need to do? Else if it is not equals, then else what I need to do? I need to throw which exception? I need to throw this invalid user exception itself or not. So first let's try to understand. I need to throw some exception means what? I need to throw some exception object itself. So that means I need to have this exception. If this is an invalid user, so then what I need to do? First of all, I need to create this exception object and I need to throw that exception object. Okay. So first of all, what we need to do? We need to create this exception class object itself or not? Invalid user exception E is equals to new invalid user exception. Okay, and we need to pass here the respective error message. Okay, let's say I'm passing here invalid user. Okay, so that means here itself first of all I created the exception object. Why? Because if this value is not equal, so or if it is an invalid user, so then it will come to the else block. Here itself what I need to do? I need to throw this exception itself. I need to throw the exception means what? I need to throw this exception object itself or not. So that is why first of all I need to create this exception class object. So now with this line there is one exception object got created. Now this exception object itself I need to throw to the color which column, right? So that is why how we see. So what we understood earlier, if any exception will occur, okay, immediately JVM will create the respective exception class object itself or not. For example, if any IO exception occurred, so immediately that IO exception object it will be getting created by the JVM itself. Okay, let's say null pointer exception occurred. With respect to the null pointer exception, there will be one null pointer exception object. It will get created immediately by the JVM itself. Okay, but now this class, those classes are nothing but predefined exception class, and those exception classes are known by the JVM itself. So that is why JVM knows when if this exception will come means, or when this exception will come. If this exception will come means I will create this respective class object. But this exception class which is a predefined class, or it is nothing but user defined exception or custom exception itself. It is nothing but the custom exception itself or not. So that is why here JVM won't create the object. Okay, because JVM does not know about this exception class itself. So that is why we explicitly need to create this class object and we need to throw that exception. Okay, how we need to throw that exception? By using one keyword called throw. Which object I want to throw? This E itself. Okay, because this E object I have created itself or not. So here itself, if this is nothing but an invalid user, so that is why what we did here, we have created one exception object here. That exception object only we are throwing, that E itself we are throwing to the color. Okay, so now as it is nothing but checked exception, because I have created this exception class by extending the exception class itself or not. So that is why it is nothing but checked exception. So as we are throwing that exception, okay, so in the method level what we need to define here? Throws which exception? Invalid user exception. Okay, so that means we are throwing that exception. So then as it is a checked exception, then compiler will force you to handle the exception or declare the throws keyword. Okay, so that is why I'm throwing that exception in the method signature level. Okay, now as it is throwing that exception, so then again compiler will force this color method here itself or not to handle this exception. So then either I can surround this piece of logic within the try and catch block, or else what I can do here, I can again throw invalid user exception. Okay, so that means here itself, now as it is throwing the exception, now as it is throwing, as this method is nothing but throwing that exception, as it is a checked exception, so then compiler will force to this color method to handle that exception itself or not. So then compiler will force here itself to surround this piece of code within this try and catch block. Okay, try and, so here itself I need to write here try and catch block. Which catch block I need to write? Invalid user exception. Okay, so we need to define here invalid user exception. Okay, so then respective handling logic I can write. Okay, but let's say I don't want to handle the exception here. Okay, so what I mean is, I don't want to handle this exception over here. Okay, so then what I need to do then? So then compiler will give me the second option. Okay, compiler will tell like, okay, so if you are not handling that exception over here, so then throws that exception here. Okay, throws invalid user exception itself. Okay, so then compiler will force us to either handle that exception or throws that exception. Okay, so that means if you see here, whenever JVM it will come now to this main, whenever if I'm trying to execute now, so JVM it will comes to this main method itself or not. Okay, what I'm doing here, I'm creating this validator class object and I'm calling this validate method, and I'm passing which value? Misra. Now it will comes to this username value, it will come as Misra. Okay, now what I'm doing here, I'm checking, I'm validating if that username dot equals to Prasanna. No, right? So as it is not equals, so then what will happen? It will comes to this else block. Okay, and here itself what I am doing here, I am creating this invalid user exception class object. Okay, and once I am creating this exception class object, then I am throwing that exception class object to its color method. Okay, as it is an checked exception. Why it is an checked exception? Because I am creating this exception class by extending this exception class. Okay, so that means it is nothing but checked exception. Now it will comes to this color method. Compiler will force here to, you need to write or you need to surround this piece of code as a try and catch block. Okay, but let's say if I am not handling that exception here, so then here itself I need to declare throws keyword. Okay, we need to declare here throws invalid user exception. If now he is not handling that exception, and here also I am not handling that exception, so that means this exception object, it will be again thrown to whom? To the JVM default exception handler. Okay, what this default exception handler it will do, on top of this exception object itself, it will call the print start trace method. So that means here I am delegating that exception object. At the end, this exception object, it will be delegated to whom? To the JVM default exception handler itself or not? What that JVM default exception handler it will do? On top of this exception object, it will call which method? Print start trace method. Okay, so as part of this print start trace method, what it will do? It will print the exception message. Okay, as part of this print start trace method, what it will do? It will print the exception name and it will print the exception message, and along with that it will print the start trace of this exception. Start trace of this exception means from where this exception object got occurred, so then it got delegated to whom? To which method again? And it got delegated to which method? Okay, all this start trace of that exception, it will get printed. Okay, how? By calling this print start trace method. If you will see here, while we are creating this exception class itself, okay, how we can create our own custom exception class? We need to create our. So can I write any class and can I tell like this is an exception class? No, right? In order to make this class as an exception class, so what we need to do? We need to extend the exception class. Okay, and after extending, so that means all the functionality of this exception class, now it will get inherited to this class. Okay, now here itself what I need to do again? We need to define the constructor. Okay, by passing the parameter as string message. Okay, and inside this constructor what we need to do, we need to call the super. Why we need to call this super here? See, let's try to understand. See, first of all, whenever this JVM it will comes to this main method, whenever if I am trying to execute now, so JVM it will comes to the main method. Okay, and here what I am doing here, I am creating this validator class object. I am calling this validate method by passing this Mishra as an argument. Okay, now this validate method it will be called, and here I am passing the Mishra. Okay, now here itself I am validating itself or not. If this username dot equals to Prasanna, so that means now it is not Prasanna, right? So that means it will comes to the else block. In this else block, what we are doing here, I am creating this exception class object. Okay, so that means how I am creating this exception class object. How we are creating this exception class object? By creating like invalid user exception is equal to new invalid user exception itself or not. So that means here itself I am trying to call this constructor itself, constructor of this invalid user exception. Okay, now how I am creating this object, invalid user exception object, invalid user exception is equals to new invalid user exception. Okay, so now while creating the object itself, I am creating this, I am trying to call this constructor of this invalid user exception. Okay, and while calling this constructor itself, I am passing this error message. Now what it will be called, at the time of creating the object itself, this constructor it will get called itself or not. At the time of, so in this constructor what it is doing, again it is calling the super class constructor. Okay, so who is the super class here? Is nothing but exception. So that means we are having one class called exception class itself or not. Okay, so whenever I am writing a super of by passing this message, what is happening? So it will go to the super class constructor. Okay, who is the super class constructor? Is nothing but exception. So that means it will call to this exception class constructor. Okay, of string message. Okay, what is happening in this exception class, or what is happening in this super class constructor? There is no logic here again. Okay, what it is happening again? Again it is calling to the super of message. Okay, so that means who is the super class of this exception now? Who is the super class of all the exception class? Is nothing but throwable itself or not. So that means this class exception is nothing but it is also extending one class called throwable. Okay, so that means we are having one class called class throwable. Okay, so then it will call which class constructor again? Throwable class constructor. So that means in this throwable there is a constructor is there again, what? Throwable of string message. Are you able to understand? So now you are calling to the super class constructor. Who is the super class constructor here? Is nothing but throwable. Okay, so here itself what it is happening, it is assigned, so there in this throwable there is one attribute called here string message. Okay, and here what I am doing here, what is happening internally, this dot message is equals to message. Okay, so that means whatever the message that I am passing here, so this message it will get delegated to this class constructor. Again it is delegating to its super class constructor. Again it is delegating to its super class constructor. And here itself that message itself whatever I am passing here, it is set into this message variable. Okay, and this message variable it will be used in which method? Is nothing but print stack trace method. Okay, so that means here in this throwable class there is a method called print stack trace method. Okay, so inside this print stack trace method only this message is being used. Okay, so that is why whenever none of the methods are handling that exception, so it will be hand over to the JVM default exception handler itself or not. So what this JVM default exception handler it will do, on top of this exception object it will call which method? Print stack trace method. Okay, while it will call, so this print stack trace method it is basically it is there in which class? It is there in nothing but throwable class. Okay, so that is why on top of this exception object, whenever it will call this print stack trace method, Okay, so what it is happening, it will print this exception type, and along with that exception message, and it will print the stack trace of this exception. Okay, so this is how we need to create our own custom exception, and this is how we need to throw this exception object itself. Okay, so how we can create our own custom exception class? By creating one class extending the either exception class or runtime exception class. If we are extending to the exception class, that means this class will become the checked exception. If we are extending it as nothing but runtime exception class, that means it is nothing but unchecked exception. Okay, and how we are going to throw that exception? By using the throw keyword. Okay, so if you see here, what I am doing here, and first of all creating this class. What I am doing here, first of all I am creating this exception class object or not, then I am throwing that exception object itself or not. So here you will see, first of all I am creating this exception object, that exception object I am holding through a variable, and I am throwing this variable itself or not. So instead of this e, can I replace with this value itself or not? Okay, I can, what I mean is, I can directly write here, throw new invalid user exception of some error message, let's say invalid user. Okay, so then I can remove this line of code. Okay, so here itself what I am doing here, so if it is an invalid user, so then it will come to this else block, and I am throwing this exception object itself. I am creating the exception object by passing this error message, and I am throwing that exception object to its caller method. As it is not also handling, so then it will goes to the JVM default exception handler. Okay, what this JVM default exception handler it is doing? Internally it is calling the print stack trace method on top of this exception object itself. Okay, and while it will call the print stack trace method itself, what it will be printed? It will print this exception type, and it will print this exception message, and as well as the stack trace of this exception. Okay, so let's try to understand how we can create our own custom exception class and how to work with this custom exception class, right? Let me take one class called class test main method. Okay, so here I'm creating one more class called, let's say, class validator. And what I'm trying to do in this validator class, let's say I'm trying to validate. Okay, so let me take one method called public void validate method. Okay, and in order to validate, it will take the input parameter as nothing but string username. So here I need to write the logic. Okay, so what logic I'm trying to write here? If username dot equals prasanna, so that means it is nothing but system.out.println of valid user. But if it is not equal, so then I need to throw the exception. Okay, so then how to throw some exception? So which exception we need to throw? So for that we need to create our own custom exception class, right? So then how we can create our own custom exception, and which custom exception we want to create? Let's say I want to create invalid user exception. Okay, for that let me create one class called, so class invalid user exception. Now can I write any class and can I tell like this is an exception class? No, right? So then in order to make this class as an exception class, so what we need to do? We need to extend which class? Exception class. Okay, so then after extending this exception class, what we need to do? We need to define a constructor over here. Okay, and while defining the constructor itself, we'll pass the some parameter. Okay, let's say string message, which error message. Okay, now as part of this constructor, what we need to do? We need to call to this superclass constructor by passing this message as an argument. Okay, so now here let me come back to this validate method. So here itself, what we need to define, what we need to do? So if this username is not valid, so then else I want to throw this exception. So which exception I need to throw? So then we need to, how we can throw this exception? Throw. So which exception object I want to throw? This invalid user exception. Okay, object. So then throw new invalid user exception. So here itself we need to pass this exception or error message itself. Okay, what error message let's say I'm passing here? Invalid user, invalid username entered, username entered. Okay, some exception message I am just passing. Okay, now if you'll see here, this is nothing but this exception class I have created by extending this exception class itself or not. So that means this exception I am creating as an which exception is nothing but checked exception. Okay, as it is a checked exception, so that is why compiler is nothing but forcing me to handle the exception, right? So if you'll see here, compiler is forcing me to handle the exception. Either I can write the try and catch block, or I can throw that exception by declaring this throws keyword. Okay, throws invalid user exception. Okay, now what I need to do? I need to call this validate method from this main method. How can I call this validate method? So validator is equals to new validator. Okay, then validator dot validate. Okay, and we need to pass the parameter. Okay, let's say I'm passing here Prasanna. Okay, now if you'll see here, this validate method, it is throwing which exception? This invalid user exception itself or not? And this invalid user exception that I have created as an which exception is nothing but checked exception, right? Why? Because I am trying to extend this exception class. So that is why here itself compiler is forcing me to either handle that exception by writing this try and catch block. Let's say if I'll write here try, let's say I will surround this piece of code within this try block. Okay, and I am writing the catch block. Okay, which catch block I need to write here? Invalid user exception E. So then I can able to handle this exception. Okay, and I will be able to write some logic here, or some handling logic or handling code I can write here. Okay, but let's say I don't, so then I will not get any compilation error. Okay, but let's say I don't want to handle this exception. Okay, so then compiler will ask me now, okay, if you are not interested to handle the exception, then again declare throws keyword by defining this invalid user exception. Okay, now let me try to execute now. Okay, now now I am passing this Prasanna as a value itself or not? So that means it is nothing but valid user itself or not? Let me try to execute. Now if you will see, now it is nothing but valid user. Okay. Now what I want to do, instead of passing the value as Prasanna, let me pass the value as Mishra. Okay, so that means I am passing some invalid username itself or not. Okay, so then what will do now? It will throw this exception. Which exception it will throw? Is nothing but invalid user exception. Okay, now see, it is throwing which exception? It is throwing invalid user exception. What is the exception message it is printing? Invalid username entered. Okay, and along with this exception name and exception message, it is printing the stack trace of this exception itself or not. So that is how we can work with this custom exception. Okay, so see what will happen here. Let me explain this code. Okay, so what is happening, how internally it is working. So whenever I am trying to execute, now JVM it will comes to this main method. Okay, and here itself I am calling this validate method and I am passing this value. Okay, now it will comes to this validate method by taking this, by passing the username as Mishra. Okay, now it is nothing but invalid user itself or not? So then it will comes to this else block. So in this else block, what I am doing here, I am creating this invalid user exception. Okay, and which exception object I am creating here is nothing but checked exception. For example, if I'll write here runtime exception. Okay, so that means now this exception is nothing but unchecked exception itself or not? Okay, so unchecked exception means if even though if I am not writing this throws keyword also, so then compiler won't ask me to either handle the exception or declare this throws keyword also. Okay, so I can remove this throws keyword also. Okay, so then compiler will not force me to handle the exception. Why? Because I have I have defined this exception as nothing but runtime exception. Okay, so that means it is nothing but unchecked exception. Okay, if I'll execute now, okay, now if you'll see, we are getting this exception name, exception message, and the stack trace of this exception. Okay, okay, so now let me explain how internally it is working. Okay, now whenever if I am trying to execute, who came into the picture? JVM. So now JVM it will comes to this main method, and I am calling the validate method, and I am passing the Misra here. Okay, now it will comes to this validate method. As I am passing some invalid name, it is coming to this else block itself or not. And how I am creating this exception class object? By calling this constructor itself. Okay, now whenever I'll call to this constructor by passing this error message, now it will goes to this constructor here. Okay, this our own custom exception class constructor. Inside this constructor, what I am performing here or what I am doing here, I am calling again super class constructor. Okay, by passing this message. Who is the super class? Is nothing but runtime exception. Okay, so then it will goes to here, it will goes to the runtime exception class constructor, and what logic it and what it is executing or what it is doing in this runtime exception class. See, it is not doing anything. Again, it is delegating this exception message to its caller. Okay, how? If I'll call to this, if I'll go to this super, okay, so it will goes to this runtime exception class constructor. Okay, again what it is doing? Again it is not doing anything. Again it is delegating this exception message to its super class constructor again. Okay, so who is the super class of this runtime exception? Is nothing but exception class only. So then again if I'll go to its super, so then again it will comes to which class? Exception class constructor. Again inside this exception class constructor, again it is calling to the super. Who is the super again? Is nothing but throwable. Now it will comes to this throwable class constructor. Inside this throwable class constructor, what it is doing, whatever the message it is being passed from our custom exception to the runtime exception to the exception class, and exception class to the throwable class. Now here itself it is assigning this message value to this detailed message. Okay, there is one variable they have defined it as nothing but detail message. Okay, to this detail message, now that message is available. Okay, now internally it will call which method? Is nothing but print stack trace method. So there is a method called print stack trace method. So now if you see here, internally it will call this print stack trace method, and in this print stack trace method itself, that detailed message it will be internally it will be used. Okay, if we'll go to this internally itself, so here itself it is printing that this object itself or not, and this object is having that detailed message itself or not. So that is why it will get printed. Okay, if now this exception object is occurred, if none of the method is handling that exception, so then at the end this exception object it will get hand over to the JVM, and JVM again it will hand over that exception object to the default exception handler, and what that default exception handler it will do, on top of that exception object itself it will call the print stack trace method. And what this print stack trace method it is doing, it will print this exception name and it will print this respective exception message, and along with that the stack trace of this exception it will print. Okay, so this is nothing but how we can create our own custom exception. Okay, and what is the difference between throws and throw keyword? See, throws is nothing but to delegate the checked exception object to its caller method. Okay, and why we are using this throw keyword? In order to throw our own custom exception object. Okay, so that is the difference between throws and throw keyword. Okay, So this is how we can create our own exception class and we can throw this exception object. Okay, so that means what do you mean by what is the difference between throws keyword and throw keyword? See, throws keyword is nothing but to delegate the checked exception object to its color method. Okay, if the respective method where that exception occurred, if that respective method is not interested to handle that exception, so then by using this throws keyword we can delegate that checked exception object to its color method. Okay, but what do you mean by throw? Throw is nothing but in order to throw our own custom exception object. Once we have created our own custom exception class object, how we can throw? By using the throw keyword. So throw is nothing but we are throwing our own custom exception object. Okay, and throws is nothing but to delegate that checked exception object to its color method. Okay, so that is the difference between throw and throws. Okay, and why we are using throw and when we are using this throw? While we are using our own custom exception, while throwing our own custom exception object, so we are using this throw keyword. Okay, so this is how we need to create our own custom exception class. Okay.